Welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, April 9th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. While we're preoccupied with presidential politics, our government is killing people around the world. International polls show that it's the United States, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel, that is by far the most feared government in the world. And that's not surprising. The U.S. is waging war in 8 countries, and its war provocations against Russia and China risk a wider, even a nuclear war. Although most Americans aren't aware of it, the U.S. government is today making war, killing people, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. They're doing so principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. The ongoing U.S. drone assassination program, called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, has killed thousands of people, most of them not the presumed targets, including American citizens and hundreds of children. More than 250,000 American troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, 1,000, yes, most of them surrounding Russia and China. The 70,000 U.S. troops of the Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities have included kidnapping, the U.S. government calls it rendition, torture, and murder. The U.S. is torturing the people of Venezuela, the country with the world's largest reserve of oil, in order to overthrow their government, which isn't following orders from Washington. Since 1945, the United States has killed between 20 and 30 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, the Mideast, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic dominance that the U.S. inherited at the end of World War II. For the American 1%. It's unfortunately the basis of U.S. foreign policy to use war and the threats of war to retard the economic development of Russia and China as competitors to American control of the world economy. From U.S. support for a fascist coup in Ukraine to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea and huge NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, we call upon the President and our government to close all foreign military bases, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income, for Americans who have been made poor by generations of our government's wars. Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, is on Facebook at Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. To date, we are welcoming as a guest James Manrique of the Champaign County's Voters Alliance, or perhaps votechampaign.org is better, James?
Yeah,
Okay.
Champaign County Voters Alliance or votechampaign.org.
Okay. James is here to talk about the recent local elections, which the News Gazette called a vote for the status quo. They gave election and nobody came? Is that what happened, James?
Well, it's actually interesting that the News Gazette called it a vote for the status quo because another local newspaper, CU Cheat Sheet, I guess they're not technically in print, but they're online, they pointed out how the city council election was actually very close for the incumbents versus the non-incumbents, because there were 3 incumbents and 5 non-incumbents, or 5 challengers. And if you take the vote totals for the 5 challengers and the vote totals for the 3 incumbents, they're only off by a little bit. Let's see. They're off by less than 300 votes. So there was 9,500 votes for the incumbents and 9,200 votes for the opposition. And there was 3,000 undervotes. So it was actually quite a close election for
An,
those
an
incumbents.
undervote is a vote for something but not everything on the ballot. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. Because it was a pick three. You voted for three people out of the eight. So if somebody only voted for one,
Oh,
or
I
only
see.
voted for two, then they undervoted, by that many.
Okay.
Or if they didn't fill out anything, it's an undervote by three. So there was 3,200 undervotes of the people that voted, and that's not taking into effect the number of people that didn't vote in the election. So to say that it was directly a re-electing of the status quo, there was a lot of opposition to it, I guess. So.
You think there's a basis in Champaign for an insurgency against the status quo? I mean, is this what we're going to see in coming elections?
I hope so, definitely. Well, I mean, I always like elections that have competition. And there's a lot of different issues in the community where some of the members in the community feel like that the city council is not doing enough to address, certain portions of the community, like Garden Hills or other parts of the community. And I think that was talked a lot about during the election. So I think there's definitely like a drive to try to replace some of that status quo. I mean, that's definitely evident by the fact that we had more people running for city council than ever ran before for the at-large position. I actually took a look at the past the past 10, 20 years of municipal elections, and for the at-large city council seats, we had 8 people running for those 3 seats, and that was the most candidates running for that type of position. In the past, there was like 6 candidates or 4 candidates, but I think having like 8 candidates really trying to, compete for those spots shows that there was a desire for change, perhaps.
So you think that could be mobilized in upcoming elections in ways that would defy the News Gazette's notion that the election was about the status quo, huh?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely the election in one hand was, would the status quo continue being the status quo? And I think that these opposition candidates and the number of votes that they got definitely shows that that the status quo doesn't necessarily have to be that way. That it is like on the edge of being outvoted if there was a big enough push for it. Because I mean, it was only off by 300 votes between those 2 different groups. The next lowest candidate from the group that won was only off by like 300 votes as well. Patsy Petrie versus
All right.
William Kyles, because William Kyles had 2,600 votes and Patsy Petrie had essentially 2,300 votes. So that's a very small difference in votes, and like I said, the undervotes could have made a huge difference. So I think it just goes to show that more people could use more information about the candidates to be more confident, and I don't know, it was pretty close.
You suggested beforehand that there was an underlying issue about housing in Champaign. How do you think that? Maybe you want to rehearse that and tell me how you think that played out?
Definitely. For the last 6 months, or maybe even longer, there's been groups in town advocating for more fair housing for low-income folks in town. There's a provision in Champaign that allows landlords to discriminate against people with felony convictions. Landlords in Champaign are allowed to discriminate against those folks for up to 5 years, regardless of what the felony conviction is. Whether or not the felony is based on, property theft or something involved in renting, it doesn't matter. They can discriminate against those folks for 5 years. And there's a group in town that's been trying to repeal that rule in Champaign. And so.
And you think that they have a strong enough following to make that important in the Champaign elections, eh?
Yeah, definitely. They did bring that up several times in the election. They brought it up at the candidate forums, and I mean, that issue definitely has a lot of support among the progressive communities in town. There's obviously a big progressive community because it's a college town, and the people in that community, that was a big issue for them, was whether or not these council members supported repealing that amendment, to because the whole point is to try to reduce recidivism. Because if somebody comes like straight out of prison, if they don't have access to housing, that's gonna, be one of the first things that's gonna get them back into prison if they don't have a clear-cut housing. So people are trying to, make this easier for those felons, and I think, as you had mentioned before, this issue kind of speaks more broadly into, minority communities and how the council feels about those communities, whether or not they feel that it's, worthwhile to put time and effort into that, or if it's, if they're more concerned about the landlords, I guess.
Tom Kasich in the News Gazette pointed out that incumbent Mayor Deb Finan in Champaign got 85% of the vote against the challenger, Azar Cobbs. And he remarks that Kasich remarks, her victory crossed all demographic and geographic groups, winning 39 of 39 precincts. Her poorest showing was in the city of Champaign Precinct 1, a predominantly African-American precinct, where she got 54% to only 46% for Cobbs, who's black. So, I mean...
I think that speaks exactly to what the issues like that we were just talking about.
Right.
Is that people feel that Deb is very much part of the status quo, very much part of the establishment. I mean, not to get too partisan, but I mean, it's a nonpartisan election, but a lot of people put Deb Finan in the boat of Republican. I believe that she's also donated money to Rodney Davis. So in my mind, it was really interesting that there wasn't more opposition against that, especially given the number of progressives in town.
That's what I wondered.
Well, I think one of the downsides was that Azar Cobbs, unfortunately, wasn't the most prepared candidate, I guess. He's ran before in the past, and a lot of different people say that he's not necessarily the most well-spoken when it comes to very technical political issues. But he did speak very much in favor of minority communities, and that's why you saw in that one precinct where it came very close, because those minority communities are wanting something different than what's being given to them currently. So I think the fact that Deb got a lot more votes is more displaying that she has the establishment behind her. The establishment, like, everybody knows her name. A lot of these local elections are about name recognition. So Azar Cobbs, he doesn't have nearly the funds or nearly the movement behind him to really get his name out there like other candidates did.
The News Gazette noted that Finan disclosed a total of $11,000 plus in individual itemized contributions from the Champaign County Chamber of Commerce PAC, $3,000 from them, $1,500 each from Karen Miller of Urbana and the State Realtors PAC, and $1,000 each from the Attorney's Title Guarantee Fund, Champaign Firefighters, Tom and Barb Frasca of Champaign, Realtor Craig McDonald, and a $1,000 in-kind contribution from the State Realtors. That sounds like a fairly homogeneous group, huh?
Yeah. I noticed a bunch of names in there are realtors. So
yes.
Once again, Deb Finan's on the side of landlords rather than renters. An interesting fact that I always find interesting about Champaign-Urbana is that there are more renters in both Champaign and Urbana than there are house owners.
Interesting.
So, it's very interesting that she's getting a bunch of money from homeowner realtor associations, that sort of thing. Like you mentioned, she also got a big contribution from the Champaign County Chamber of Commerce. They were backing all of the incumbent candidates, and, I think it really showed that their backing helped with that name recognition, helped kind of push those candidates through, I'd imagine. So it's
and they also pointed out that Cobbs didn't even form a campaign committee with the State Board of Election, and so didn't report any contributions. It was hardly an even up match.
Exactly. So exactly like you're saying, like Cobbs, like it says right there, he doesn't even have the committee. And unfortunately felt like he didn't have as much of it together as like other candidates that I've seen in the past. And so it really makes you think, like, if there was an actual a stronger progressive candidate with more of a backing from the progressive community or more funds even, even if a progressive candidate had the same funds of Deb Finan, I'm sure that progressive candidate could have made a much bigger impact on the voter turn, on the disparity of votes between those.
Kasich, remarkably enough, in the News Gazette, didn't reflect on student vote and the universities present in the election, as if they weren't there.
They basically weren't, unfortunately, and that's unfortunately the case with most municipal elections, well, pretty much across the board for student turnout. Primary elections, they do a little bit better, but municipal elections, it's under 3% voter turnout for the students, and that was the case this time. It was actually interesting, like most of the campus precincts had an increase in voter turnout compared to their average. But that increase is, 10 people compared to 5 or something, I mean, just over the last couple years, some of these campus precincts had 12, 3, 6, 9 votes for the whole precinct. There's like 1,000 registered voters in that precinct. So that's, that's a constant struggle of how to connect these municipal elections to students. Because these municipal elections do impact issues that the students care about and impact issues that affect the students, because the property taxes can affect, I say that, but I don't think city council does. Do they do much with property taxes? Nonetheless, there's a lot of things that the students care about. Like the city council can impact minority communities. The park district impacts the environment and the ecology. So there's a lot of students that really care about environmental issues. The school board impacts, low-income families, and, that's a big concern to a lot of students and progressive-minded people.
Another thing that was clearly missing in this election was any reference to issues outside of Champaign. I've been a Champaign resident long enough to remember that there were times when issues of war and peace, which is a particular concern of us here at Aware on the Air, actually impacted local elections. And the Champaign and Urbana governments both took positions on things like the American invasion of Iraq and other aspects of war making that the U.S. was involved in. As far as I can tell, there has been zero concern about anything beyond the bounds of Champaign-Urbana, or at least, or Illinois at least, in local elections recently.
Well, definitely for the municipal election, that's true, because the municipal election really just affects the local municipalities, so there's not a lot of reason for them to talk about things outside of that.
Except for the fact that the city councils in both cities have taken positions on national issues in the past, and even sponsored a referenda on it.
Yeah,
long ago and far away, and the wench is dead, as the poet says.
I do remember those referendum, and I know that there were some people that criticized because it's kind of like, it's a non-binding referendum, and it's kind of just more of a pat on the back type of thing. But
an expression of
oh, definitely.
Community understanding.
And certainly what I would say, too, is that those referendum actually tend to help drive voter turnout, because when
That's a very good point.
When you have that referendum on the ballot, you have a much more clear case for the individual voter to vote on, like, a core issue. I mean, because with the city council and the school board, it's a lot of proxy voting. You're voting for candidates that support the issues that you like,
right,
or that you hope support, like minority issues, that sort of thing. Whereas with the referendum, it's a direct vote on a direct issue, and that often, a lot more times, encourages people to go to the polls. You were talking about city referendum, but a lot of times there's also like county-wide referendum. Yep. Like the last municipal 2017, there was the referendum about the nursing home. Obviously, that drove a ton of voter turnout because that was like a really important referendum. But just in general, when there's a county-wide referendum, that will drive voter turnout because there's a lot more clear-cut reason for the individual voter to vote.
So much so that, in fact, the legislature restricted strongly the ability to run local referendum a while ago, didn't they? I mean, they were upset enough about people expressing opinions on the war, usually against the war, and maybe even other things such as the local issues you mentioned, that, in fact, there was a sudden move by this sclerotic Illinois legislature to make it far more difficult to run such a referenda, particularly on national issues.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but I do know that there's like a limitation on the number of referendums that you can have on a ballot. And in the past, that's been an issue too, where like if they're trying to prevent a specific referendum from getting on the ballot, they can flood the ballot with referendums that are kind of just fluff or whatever, and then that can keep more important things off.
And even the difficulty of presenting a referendum to the voters by a local group, as peace groups did in the past, has been made much more difficult by the legislature. They don't want that sort of nonsense to trouble the tender minds of the voters, because it might mean that the legislature has to do something, and instead the legislature is busily voting in favor of restricting the use of state university monies in any way that aids the boycott of Israeli apartheid. I mean, this is there are major political issues bubbling around under the surface here, and sometimes they're not an obvious up or down vote or an obvious support for a candidate that people can understand as being what's at stake. Other things are at stake, up to and including national politics.
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely encourage, I think referendum are a great way to drive the turnout, like I was mentioning earlier, and I would almost say that, just as a rule of thumb, I think they should try to aim for at least one referendum on the ballot each time, so.
That's an excellent idea. I mean, that a mythical organization called Students for a Democratic Society existed long ago in the last century, began as a campaign with the motto, "Let the people decide." And it was in favor of referenda of this sort and issues of of national as well as local import being placed on the ballot for this sort of vote, even when it was an advisory referendum. The legislature, the permanent government gets burnt by this and want to make sure they're not bothered by it too much anymore, I think.
Oh, exactly. Well, and that's the nice thing with referendum, too, that even if they're non-binding, they're a great way to show what the population wants out of a given group of people. If I'm not mistaken, there was a referendum on the ballot in, 2015 or somewhere thereabouts for Illinois, statewide, asking if there should be a millionaire tax.
Yes.
And of course, it overwhelmingly got a yes vote. I think it was 70% or more said, yes, we should tax millionaires specifically, like their own tax. And has the legislator done anything with that? No.
A very good point.
But,
a very good point. And those tax issues are obviously going to be important in this new gubernatorial term, because the governor has been elected, and the thing that most people, the new governor has been elected on issues of a graduated tax, and something will have to be done with that. So we will hear more about it, eh?
Yeah, it's certainly fascinating. Yeah, definitely.
What other observations do the elections suggest to you?
Muhammad was a really interesting one for me because I wasn't expecting Muhammad to be as popular an election as it was. Muhammad was one of the most popular elections in the county.
Interesting.
For the votechampaign.org, we keep a little bit of stats on which elections are getting the most views. And the Parkland Board of Trustees was at the top. Champaign elections were after that. Urbana was about half as popular as Champaign, but then Muhammad was almost exactly as popular as Urbana, which was interesting to me. And then also the voter turnout in Muhammad was higher than average across the board. For all the Muhammad precincts, the voter turnout was higher than average given the last 5 or 10 years, or actually the last 10 years of municipal elections. And it was actually higher in 2 of the precincts than it was in 2017. So voter turnout in Muhammad was actually higher. And from what my friend Ben Chapman had told me, he writes for the Muhammad newspaper, he says that a lot of people in Muhammad moved there for their schools. And so the races that were up in Muhammad were for the school boards. And
really?
Apparently the people in Muhammad were very concerned about the school boards. I don't know as much about it, but I guess some things had recently changed.
What was the school board doing or not doing that caused the interest?
Unfortunately, I don't have the good part of that information, but I know that there has been recent changes, like also on the city council or the village trustees in Mahomet, where there's been some disagreement with how the village trustees have been doing things, and unfortunately, the village trustees weren't contested. So Ben was saying that some people were taking that frustration out and trying to, change things where they could on the school board because the school board was contested.
Are there racial questions here, or as we say these days, diversity?
I'd imagine that it's school board, so that's a big thing going around both in Urbana, Champaign, and I'm sure in many schools right now is how the schools affect low-income students because there's issues of discipline, whether or not they suspend first and then ask questions, or whether or not they look into, what is causing this child to act out. Should we, try to, instead of disciplining them, should we try to help them? So that's like a much bigger issue just in general for schools. And then also schools have been battling with classroom sizes. I know that that's a problem in Urbana, and I'm sure it's a problem across the board, is that classroom sizes are sky high. So people, are wanting to reduce that to get better education for their kids.
And this could dovetail with some of the tax issues as well, because the issue here, of course, is what sort of money you're going to spend on the schools, right?
Exactly. It's our tax dollars that fund these schools. It's our tax dollars that pay for these schools. So, people want to say in how their tax dollars get spent. That's always one of the biggest motivators for me as a voter. I just did my taxes like a week ago. I procrastinated on it, but taxes for me are always a broad reminder of exactly why I care so much about politics, because they take, for Illinois, 5% off the top for income tax. So just, that's time that you're working every day that they just take from you. So you should have a say in how that money's spent. And you should definitely want, a say in that.
Maybe it would make a difference if the elections were held after instead of before tax time.
Or if you filed your taxes with your ballot.
There we go. That may be what's at stake.
Yeah. So, but the Mahomet election was very close. The numbers were extremely close for the candidates that won versus the ones that didn't. If I'm not, I should have studied this just a little bit more beforehand, but I'm pretty sure that most of the incumbent candidates won for the school board, but the numbers were very close for the turnout. The difference being only about 100 votes or so. And then once again, the undervotes, there was two different school board slots, and for both of those school board slots, the undervotes had more votes than the difference. So there was 240 undervotes for both, and the difference in who won versus who didn't was, less than 200 votes. So once again, those races were very, very close. And, that talks about how people are eager for a change, or people are eager to engage in that when they know about it.
Thank you very much for this account. What other conclusions do you have from the votes in general in this election?
What other conclusions? I think I already mentioned before that the city council race had the most candidates running for it than ever before, which
like
is
the Democratic presidential race in 2020, huh?
Yeah, but it definitely shows that people are eager for change in that regard. So even though that there wasn't, like, the voter turnout for the county was pretty low, it wasn't like the lowest ever, but it was very low. But it is interesting that there were a lot of candidates running. So I think
people need, the political people need jobs too. Is that what's at stake?
Well, actually, for these municipal elections, the pay isn't nearly as good. Because that's I wholeheartedly think that is the case for state elections and county-wide elections, because those paychecks are big. A lot of the county, I'm not kidding, the county positions get like $100,000. Like the county-wide ones, like city clerk, county executive, both of those get $100,000 a year. And that's a lot of money.
I'm actually surprised at that. I didn't know that. The city clerk, Champaign, makes $100,000 a year?
105, yeah. It's public records. And, our Congress people, they do more work, but they get 107. Like Rodney Davis makes $170,000 a year just for being a congressman.
How about that?
I'm not sure what the state representative's pay is, but I'm pretty sure that it's in 70,000 plus. That pay is not nothing to somebody that's normally working, just your average run-of-the-mill job. 70, 100,000 might not be a lot for, a PhD professional or somebody that has like a master's degree or something. But for your average run-of-the-mill citizen, 70, 100 grand, that's a lot of money. So
That is a lot of money.
Career politician is no joke. A lot of politicians are in it for the pay, for the fact that it's, a cushy job that there's, if you mess up, you only have to face the voters once every X number of years. So it's not like your boss can just be like, why haven't you come into work? I don't know. So,
And the legislature sets its own pay grade, don't they? I mean, there's nobody else. I mean, I suppose it does it by statute, and therefore the governor has to sign off on it at some point. But usually that's I don't remember that being an issue in the 30 years I've lived in Illinois.
Yeah, I don't know. I think different branches decide their pay in different ways. I think like the county board decided the pay of like the executive and the clerk and that sort of thing. So I don't think like the clerk necessarily sets his own pay.
No, I think yes, I see that.
But Congress people, I think you might be right on that regard. Congress people might be able to set their own pay, and yeah, I mean, I think if people knew what their politicians were, that's why it's all about taxes. It's all about we pay this money all the time. Not only do we pay income taxes, but we pay property taxes. Not only that, but we also pay sales taxes,
Yes.
and we get taxed so many different ways. By the end of the day, you ended up being taxed like 15-20% of what you normally make. You should want a say in where that money's going.
This seems eminently reasonable. I've been saying for a while, when we've talked about issues of this sort, that the remarkable ignoring of the obvious way to fund a good bit of the deficit that the state of Illinois runs is a sales tax, but not a sales tax on the hamburger you buy for dinner, a sales tax on financial transactions. When you buy and sell stocks and bonds, when you call your broker on LaSalle Street and have him or her do things that helps your bottom line, there should be a tax on that. If they're going to tax you on milk and cheese, they should tax you on stocks and bonds.
Yeah,
right?
definitely. And not only that, but the financial transaction tax could, not only is it good to tax those just because we tax everything else, but in addition, it could prevent some of the malicious trading styles, because there's a lot of high-frequency trading, which a lot of even like stock traders don't necessarily like it because it's kind of market manipulation stuff. And that high-frequency trading, it's allowed to happen because there's no taxes on it. They don't have like a tax on each trade. Whereas if you tax each trade, even if you tax the trade a very small amount, like $1.50 or $3,
right.
So like you're doing these trades that are hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million trade, it's not even a percentage. It's just a flat, like $1.50, $3 charge per trade. So it wouldn't even affect big trading. It only affects the high frequency. Well, it affects all trading, but it would more primarily affect the high frequency trading and really discourage that. And that would, in theory, help the economy because it wouldn't be this detrimental force in this market manipulation.
To say nothing of the fact it would produce some of the revenue that the state so desperately needs, right?
Yes, it has so many good uses. Not only is it good for preventing that, but then it's also good for, like you said, generating more income for these different projects. And
there was actually a candidate, or rather a competitor for the Democratic nomination for governor in Illinois, who mentioned again, it's been mentioned a good deal before, financial transaction tax. He lost out to Mr. Pritzker, but he then said he supported Pritzker without Pritzker's taking up his suggestion for a financial transaction tax.
Yeah, but you kind of have to do that, unfortunately, in those situations where you lose the primary. It's unfortunately kind of the nature of the political beast that you have, like that you kind of have to endorse the next person because of the whole two-party system. But
my point was that there is it's not a mystery as to who opposes the financial transaction tax.
Oh,
And,
yes.
they may not be numerous, but they are wealthy, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a similar thing, too, for all the politicians that don't release their tax returns. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Pritzker is another one that hasn't released his tax returns. And I mean, people call for Donald Trump to release his tax returns. I think all politicians should, or at least any running for a high enough office. I mean,
and when you're manipulating those various things that redound to the credit, if that's the word, of your tax returns. Certainly, they should.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, James. This is very interesting indeed. Do you have a concluding comment or remark you want to go to?
Not much. I mean, just focusing on the undervotes. It was really eye-opening to me just how many undervotes there were for every different position. There's undervotes in every election, but I feel like that the municipal election, that the undervotes were a bigger percentage.
I mean, I was an undervoter, I think, in the sense that I didn't fill out every oval available to me. But that's because I either didn't care or I was more or less even on the people involved. You think that's a mistake?
Not necessarily. I mean, you should definitely only vote for people that that you're informed on and people that you're confident on. Well, I mean, that speaks to why there's so many undervotes, I feel like, for this municipal election, is that there's a lot more uncertainty with the candidates that are running.
That's a good point.
So that's why I say that I was really shocked by how many undervotes there were in this election, because, like I say, there's always undervotes. There's always some percentage of people that, don't have the information or just don't care about the candidates or whatever. But that percentage is usually very small, at least in the state and presidential elections. The percentage of undervoters is usually like 5% or less. But the percentage of undervoters for this municipal election is a lot higher. Like, undervotes for Parkland Board of Trustees, there was 10,000 undervotes. That's huge. So, and that's very similar for a lot of the different races that were up for election. And those undervotes could have made the difference. I mean, not to mention the vast number of people that didn't vote at all could have made, a substantial difference in any direction. But even just the people that showed up, if they had had more information on the candidates running, they might have been able to make more well-informed decisions. So I think the undervotes just speaks to a general need to get more civic education out there, more, just voter awareness in general. So.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, recorded in the studios of Urbana Public Television on April 9th in the 15th week of 2019. Another week in which everyone can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making, for which its principal criminal associates these days are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel. The U.S. government aids the Saudis in their near-genocidal war in Yemen and the Israelis in their racist oppression of the Palestinian people. The Israeli government has murdered protesters at the fence with Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison camp. U.S. supports that primarily because Israel is a U.S. stationary aircraft carrier for the U.S. control of Mideast energy, Mideast gas and oil, a weapon against U.S. economic rivals from Venezuela to China. Such outrages cannot be dismissed as something that only happens in the global South. In the Illinois legislature, our local representative, Carol Ammons, refused to vote against using University of Illinois funds to support Israeli apartheid, something Ammons would never have done for South African apartheid. On this show, we try to concentrate on the shamefully underreported news of U.S. war-making, from the local concerns to national. Thanks to our guest, James Manrique of Champaign County Voters Alliance, votechampaign.org. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman, with Andrew Scollery, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for Russiagate, propaganda, and the attacks on WikiLeaks. We'll conclude today with Ray McGovern of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity on the U.S. government's violation of press freedom and its persecution of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. This is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.